Hello everyone, welcome to what is basically going to amount to another rant video. So if you can hearing noise in the background, that's because I'm recording at the university. And currently there are some chaps up near the library who are deciding to just chop up all the rails on the stairs. This is because they're doing maintenance and they're just having a fun time with some grinders. Meaning that I've had to reposition a couple of times to just try and get rid of some of that noise, but as you know, with industrial noise, it's quite significant, so you're never really going to escape it. So I apologise if you hear anything. Also, I'm recording outside without my mic, so there might be a bit of wind interference in the audio. Anyway, with that out of the road, we're just going to get on the topic. So basically, this video is primarily in response to a couple of things that America's done. First and foremost is the withdrawal of about 4,000 personnel within a armoured mechanised division from Poland, and second of all, the cancellation of the deployment of a army artillery unit that would operate TLAM, which is Tomahawk land attack missile, and the SM-6 within Europe. This was supposed to be deployed to Germany, but has now been cancelled from deploying to Germany. Now, reason for this is primarily basically Europe not wanting to involve itself in America's Iran war, and primarily also a lack of investment or support in certain areas. Now, a lot of this support is really weird because this doesn't really make much sense in the grand scheme of things. First and foremost, like, Germany really doesn't have a huge long-range blue water navy, which kind of makes things kind of difficult here. Their navy is also struggling as usual with everyone else's navies because they haven't invested enough money into it. And of course, there are a bunch of problems. Now, that being said, Germany is in a bit of a weird position because, like, Germany hasn't necessarily been the most super pro-American force. Like, there's been some issues, but they have been spending a lot of money on American capabilities and American technology. However, what's really potentially the most insulting or harmful thing here is the cancellation or withdrawal of personnel from Poland. Now, this actually completely apparently caught the Polish by surprise as well. This wasn't something they thought was going to happen.
Poland was notified by the secretary.
We don't know.
Well, I already know the answer because they called me yesterday. They did not know. They were blindsided.
Which is really a significant blow to Polish-American relations, especially given, like, the context behind this. You got to keep in mind, a lot of Americans really do look up to Poland or really like Poland. This is for several key reasons. First and foremost, Polish support for basically everything America does. So, or at least official support, where basically they've supported the conflict in Iran or America's operations in Iran. They've supported American operations just worldwide generally. They're buying a lot of weapons and American weapons to build up their own military to counter Russia, and basically the list kind of just goes on. However, the fact that this has led to a lot of, and they also have a really strong immigration policy, which again a lot of Americans look up to. Now, this leads into a bit of a problem, which is basically a lot of Americans sort of view Poland as the little Texas of Europe. Now, whether or not that's an accurate summary, or whether or not you agree with that, that's a different kind of topic. But basically, this has led to a general consensus that Poland's pretty cool. Now, this kind of goes and gets spat in the face, but basically the current move from the Trump administration kind of spits in the face of that assertion. Now, the thing is that, like, Germany, I guess there is a bit of controversy that could be had there, right? Germany's not necessarily too close in the front line. Maybe Europe could step up its own capabilities in missile strike, and maybe that doesn't need to be deployed into the European theaters, and maybe those capabilities have to be deployed elsewhere, like the Indo-Pacific region. That's an argument I can understand. But for Poland, though, it doesn't really make much sense. Now,
I know this wasn't your decision. This was the Secretary of Defense's decision. But I got to tell you, it's reprehensible. It's an embarrassment to our country, what we just did to Poland, in my view. So I know you said we had coordination with NATO or EUCOM. The real question is why? Why have we pulled 2 armor brigades out of Eastern Europe?
Yes, sir. I'm not on the policy side here.
But you are the Chief of Staff of the Army. There
true.
is no good explanation why we just removed 2 armored brigades from Eastern Europe.
Now, keep in mind, 4,000 personnel is an armoured division, or is an armoured force. However, that being said, I don't believe it's significant enough to actually weaken Poland or destroy their capability. But it's more about the message that's being sent here rather than the actual action itself, especially given the fact that, like I keep saying, right, support for Poland or American support for Poland publicly is quite high. And a lot of Americans like Poland, a lot of Polish people like America. And that sort of leaves this really weird place where it's like, that sort of just goes out the window. You know, you just kind of spat in the face of a country that's really, really pro-you. Like, in a lot of ways, it's like Ukraine and Russia. Like, early on the Ukraine war, the Ukrainians were so happy with America. They had this huge amount of support for America and this huge, like this super optimistic view that, you know, America's this force so good, the Americans are going to save them, and, you know, it's the Americans that are perfect, and, you know, we want the Americans. And now they're sort of backing off, and they sort of look at America going like, we don't really trust you anymore. You know, like, we want to like you, but you don't give us reasons to trust us. Or you don't give us reasons to trust you, right? And that's part of the problem that I'm worried you might start seeing with Poland, especially given how staunchly pro-American Poland is. That impacts things. It does cause a lot of damage, and that's not going to be easy to repair. And we don't know if the Trump administration is going to do more withdrawals or cancel more aid or military personnel. Like, we don't know how far this is going to go because, well, this stuff was all made basically on the decision of the Pentagon itself, just basically overnight. Nobody was consulted in Congress. No one else was really asked about this. This was just unilateral action from America and the Trump administration. And that puts a lot of shade onto how far, you know, trust with America can go. If they're just going to withdraw 4,000 personnel overnight, or they're going to just announce within a day that, oh yeah, we're going to start withdrawing personnel, who knows what they're going to do in 2 months' time or 3 months' time? Who knows what the actual approach is going to be in, you know, half a year's time? You know, what if Trump really, what if Poland pushes back on this and, you know, goes, okay, well, we're not buying certain American weapons, we're going to start buying stuff from Korea, or, you know, we might start buying European weapons. And then that leads to a massive degradation and what if that leads to a massive degradation between, you know, the American viewpoints and the Polish viewpoint? You know, what if suddenly Trump then goes, oh, well, you know, you're buying these European weapons, I'm going to cancel all personnel to Poland, right? And that's a hypothetical, but we've seen Trump's reactions to a lot of things. Trump often does come from this, like, Trump often does react in the extreme to things that may not necessarily be quite as extreme. And the problem is that could hurt relations, that could have wider implications across the region, and that sort of plays in this real, I guess, anti-European narrative that's often getting put out by a lot of people in the Republican Party. And I think that leads to this real view of, like, what we're seeing is basically just collective punishment for the sake of collective punishment. It's not actually fixing anything, and it's not actually doing anything within Europe, and it's not actually solving any of the problems. In fact, it's really just making them worse. Now, somebody's going to say, well, you know, that would probably increase the, you know, Europeans' independence, which is good, right? And I agree to some extent, but at the same time, like, you got to understand, America needs that influence. America needs that soft power. Soft power is one of the most important factors you can have as a military or as a country, right? Soft power is the ability to make a country do what you want. Actually, no. So the definition of power within the political, basically a geopolitical sense, is effectively the ability to make a country act in a way that may not necessarily correlate or be aligned with its interests. And that's what soft power is, right? You have the two power types, soft and hard. Hard power is deployment of military assets, kinetic use of kinetic measures, and then soft power is the utilization of things like diplomacy, tariffs, sanctions, whatever. And that's sort of that allows you to overall influence a country's decision making. But if you end up destroying your soft power, which is something that America seems to be doing at the moment, you end up destroying your power. You end up destroying your capacity to have influence or decision making. And this is a problem because, quite simply, America doesn't want to lose that power, because one of the big advantages America has is the ability to have its allies. This is one of the differences between Russia and China. You see, Russia and China theoretically are very powerful countries on their own. There's not really too many countries that could easily stand up against them. I mean, Ukraine's been building up since 2014, and of course has got a very strong anti-Russia approach. And the Ukrainians have also received a lot of aid from Europe. However, there are a lot of European countries, like Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, which aren't super big. They have militaries numbered in a couple thousand personnel. And that's difficult for them to defend themselves against Russia, because Russia doesn't have to deploy significant forces or do significant force restructuring to establish a significant advantage over them. And that's an issue. And what makes these countries actually stand up against them or be able to stop this kind of aggression or stop Russian aggression is NATO, right? The coalition of countries that would agree that if these countries were to come under attack, they would step in and assist. And it's the same thing with countries like China, right? America in a one-on-one would probably lose a war to China because of just the tyranny of distance. America has to deploy its forces so far whilst keeping itself spread across the world. But then you throw into account countries like Japan, Korea, you've got the Philippines to some extent, potentially Indonesia, you have Australia, you have New Zealand, and suddenly it starts to the situation starts to change. It stops being this, one-dimensional war. It's now a 3 or 4-dimensional war, where, for instance, Australia might not necessarily be able to support an outright invasion of China, or may not be able to do that, but we can throw enough assets up there that you don't want to disrespect an Australian force. They can free up American units to prioritise in other areas. Australia would be able to put up enough forces to likely take some of those reefs that China's been setting up, or at least seriously damage them or degrade their capabilities. And all that leads to a situation where, America's able to free up more forces, it's able to focus in other areas, and it's able to stage from Australia and these other countries. Now, the problem is, if you destroy your ties with Europe, you basically achieve the opposite of that. You end up losing these ties with these other countries. And the truth is, right, if you end up destroying your ties with those other countries, you put yourself in a significantly weaker position. And that's the real problem America has now. It's that if it ends up ruining these ties, if it ends up breaking like the things that keep it close to Europe and the reliance that Europe has upon America, suddenly you have a very dangerous Europe, right? From the American standpoint, you have a very different Europe, because now you have a Europe that's free to do whatever it wants, and you can't control it. You have no control over what Europe does. And this is one of those things that people like me have sort of been saying about Ukraine. It's like, Ukraine is now one of the strongest militaries in Europe, if not the strongest military in Europe, right? They have the most combat experience. They have the most understanding. They have the most comprehension of how to operate militaries, deal with military threats. This was one of the things when Viktor Orban, for instance, was threatening Ukraine with, invasion because, of Hungarians supposedly being oppressed, which is a load of bullshit. But, Viktor Orban was arguing this. And basically, everyone was like, guys, your military is like 30,000 personnel. The first Azov brigade is like 60,000. They don't even need to deploy the entire Azov brigade to deal with you. Just counter your whole military. And this is like the whole military, right? This isn't the army. This is the whole military. And that's sort of, I think, struck home. And we've seen a recent exercise where NATO doctrine and planning has just proven to be the most not work at all. And we saw that in the, I believe, 2023 counteroffensive down in Zaporizhia, where NATO doctrine and planning was just not working against Russian defensive lines. And that led to the collapse of that offensive and the collapse of those operations. And that's the problem that I think, America's starting to find itself in, is that you have this country now that's one of the most battle-hardened countries in Europe that's got this mastery now of asymmetric warfare that now doesn't like you, or may not be your best friend, or may not be a big fan of you. And what happens if those countries, hypothetically, and what if you annoy enough countries that suddenly these countries actually are proactively against you? What if you destroy your ties with these countries to the extent that they turn against you? And that can hurt you, because, this is the thing, that hurts alliances with countries like Australia, for instance, because we're also pretty close with a lot of these European allies. And yeah, we're close with America, but we're also close with Britain. We're also close with these countries. And we have significant amounts of our populace have European heritage, which means that we can have problems down the track. And this is all part of this equation. And I'm not going to say it's going to end with a war against America, but what it means is America loses a significant amount of its influence. And American interventionism and American deployment and American use of personnel in different areas really falls apart because America's allies in a lot of these other areas and regions aren't truly allies. Like the UAE, for instance, isn't really pro-America. They're basically in it for the money, right? They're in it for the resources, the protection racket. They're all in it for that. But that's really it. Israel, whilst it is a American ally, hasn't ever really helped America in a serious war, right? Like many of these conflicts Israel's been involved in are conflicts that would directly threaten them or put themselves at risk. But they're not deploying personnel or equipment to do things that, well, America wants. Like, for instance, Strait of Hormuz. Israel hasn't deployed any warships to actually open the strait. And that's a problem, right? I mean, that's a big issue. So America starts to fall back on these other allies that may not really be true allies, right? And there's this real connection between the UAE and the Chinese government. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people like myself have been putting a bit of alarm out when it comes to the UAE potentially buying F-35s. Because do you really want a group that has strong ties to one of your biggest rivals to have some of your best technology? Like that can hurt you a lot. It can cause a lot of problems. And that basically leads into that dilemma that we have at the end of the day. We have a lot of issues. And right now, this kind of action does not support America. It doesn't support its interests. And it's just being petty. Like, overall, yes, Europe needs to pick up its game. Europe needs to have picked up its game 20 years ago. You know, at the very least, Australia has a defence that the rise of China only happened about 13 years ago, where it's at that point where it's actually able to seriously threaten us and significantly challenge American supremacy in the region. But at the same time, we should have also, and you watch any of my videos, you'll notice that I've said this, we also need to have done this stuff 20 years ago. The planning that we're making now is not, wow, this is good planning. This is planning that should have been a long, long time ago, and that any of us could have told you, or any of us within the analytical community could have told you that you should have made these decisions decades ago. But that's where we're at now. But yeah, that's all I've really got for now. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you very much. Goodbye.